How's it going, YouTube? Quentin today with another video, and today, guys, the review is going to be an updated way to hand trap guide, and I do hope that you enjoyed today's video. This is my favorite series to make, and I'm going to be doing some updates as far as Dude goes, but also as far as current goes, in case you have an event coming up before Dude. Definitely go ahead and check out my sponsors over in Gem, Cloud, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, RW, MainPhaze, and Grimoire down below in the description. But also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so we can hit our goal at 30,000. I'd really appreciate it. Now, without further ado, let's talk about a few things. The first thing I want to talk about today is going to be you have to Imperm Naroi. If you have Valor, Imperm, whatever you got, you want to throw it on Naroi. This is now the normal summon that you're going to be seeing coming down in K9 Crystron, and even if they're playing like the K9 VS deck, this is going to be the card that you want to stop. We're going to be seeing Pure K9 pop up, which is going to have a lot more of the artifact lock with the Princess, so that's something that you really want to be aware of as well. But you always want to Imperm Naroi, because this card is a lot of free information that allows your opponent to play around everything you got, which is kind of annoying, because if your hand is like Nibiru, Ash, or something, they can just kind of make a plan for that as they go, right? So the card does provide a lot of very free information, and that makes me almost feel like if you have Ash, you might even want to just like Ash the case, but you might want to just wait for the Naroi itself and then Ash that, because especially if they're on Vanquish Soul cards, you're still going to want to Ash Rosin. So this is something to really think about, but Imperm will almost always be going on Naroi now. But again, that is the normal summon, so that's the card that we're going to be seeing quite often now. Now, exclusively Valor or Ash, if they start Rosin, you can do Imperm, but if it's later on in the combo, I would say Valor or Ash on Rosin always. But the second that you see a Ripper come down, you want to go ahead and Imperm this, especially if you have like an Ash or a Valor, because you don't want your opponent to be able to get the set of the X-Force as well. So just want to cut off everything that you can at the Ripper with an Imperm, Valor or Ash onto Rosin. Nibiru definitely depends. It also is going to vary with if you have another hand trap, if you have like Valor or Imperm, because if you do, then you can wait way later, because if they have a Ripper on the board, it doesn't really matter, right? Because at that point, you can just go ahead and stop that whenever you need to. But sometimes your opponent will just extend because they're not really prepared for the Nibiru to drop. Nibiru is going to be highly debatable on when you're going to be able to drop this, because it's really going to depend on their opening. Bell is unironically very good in this matchup to be able to stop the Rock add back, because that ends up playing a huge role in the matchup. If your opponent gets the Rosin back in their hand, not only is that potentially a second fire, but it is a fire if they didn't already have one for a Holy Seal or the Xiaolong Search. So definitely very important to go ahead and stop the add back. You can also crow the monster that they're trying to add back, and that's even better. So something else to just keep in mind. Ogre still goes to the field spell because you don't want them to be able to search another monster. You don't want them to be able to set the trap card, both of which are very strong. But Imperm, at the end of the day, is one of the best things that you can open, because stopping Ripper is going to be very important. Now, Dracotail is definitely a matchup where Nibiru is very bad, and it's a card that you don't really want in. So DD Crow on the Urgula target is really solid, just because you get the Urgula out of the graveyard, and you also banish the monsters that they're targeting, which is pretty fire. Understand that if your opponent goes Urgula target Femina, and then you DD Crow the Femina, the Urgula will still go back to the bottom of the deck because it has to resolve as much as possible. So they do lose both. Now, if you have Bell or Ash in your hand, it's going to be really solid, especially going second, because you're going to be able to stop the Flame or the Horn. But you can also use Ash to stop them from comboing instead of to help you combo, right? Because stopping the Flame or the Horn is sometimes the difference of a game win and a game loss, right? But Ash and Ketu is just way better than Rahu, in my opinion, because the Ketu could mean that they're going to be adding like a Femina, which you can't Ash anyways at that point. They're just going to be able to combo anyway. But the Rahu is just going to be sending one from the deck and the hand to the grave. So it's like less things are going off, and they're usually just making like a Gulamel. So like if you let your opponent go like full combo anyways, usually it's like Flame Horn, Gulamel, Arthalion, and I just don't necessarily care about that, right? So stopping the Ketu and not allowing my opponent to get to a Femina in hand, so they can't just like start looping Femina, right? And especially if they're going second and activating Ketu, Ketu is way scarier than Rahu. I don't want this card to resolve, because at that point they can just summon whatever they want to, right? And obviously it's still a spellcaster or a dragon, but there's a lot other options than just Dracotail monsters with this one. So I'm always ashing Ketu. Valor or Imperium on Arthalion, this should be rather common sense, right? This card is just like the be-all end-all of the deck. You don't want them to be able to get a lot of free advantage, so definitely go ahead and stop this card. Ghost Ogre is definitely an interesting one. If your opponent normal summons Lucas or Malulu and uses the effect, I really just like using Ogre on these because of the fact that you're going to deny your opponent another card that they're going to be able to set, because you're denying them a fusion material. And even though Ogre is not that great, if you're already maining Ogre and you need somewhere to place it, this is the best place to place it. Next up is Canine Crystron. Now, we already talked about Imperium onto Naroi, so that trumps everything you see here. If you have Valor or Imperium for Naroi, you want to drop it on Naroi, because that one card is full Crystron combo. So that's something that you really want to stop, because it can put up Ripper and then do combo, so you need to stop that deck early. This is another spot where you could drop Imperium, though. Again, Ripper, I think that's really good. Or on Solfador. That card is really good to be able to get to your opponent just as full combo as they need to be. So either or is fine, but I feel like we're going to start seeing a lot more normal summon Naroi, and like 3 Case of Canine, 3 Naroi, so you're going to see it a lot. That's a card that you want to stop. Definitely go ahead and Ogre the Cluster. That's going to be really solid for you. Ash on the Graveyard effect of Tristaro, so your opponent can summon 2 5s from deck and make something like Infinity. You can Bell the effect of Elskeltis. This is really important too, because you deny your opponent the access to Cluster, or if they needed like an extender or what have you, they don't get that back either. So definitely very important to think about. Not having to deal with Cluster on top of everything else could be really important, because the reason why a lot of people like Ogre so much is because of the fact that it actually destroys the body as a hand trap, right? So Cluster can be very annoying going second, especially if you're playing something like Yummy, because you go normal summon Cat and they pop it. And if you don't have something like Obedience School, it gets a little bit harder to play. Nibiru right now, there's no like solid endpoint to ever just go ahead and drop Rock. But if they go for Nova, you can Rock, because a lot of people don't play the actual fusion target. Like if they do, that's not real. So something just keep in mind. But Nibiru, this format is really just going to depend on when the best time is in your match, and that's really subjective. And it's hard to say a very specific spot. Like, we don't have, like, Necroquip and Graver right now to be like, hit it there, right? And it's really going to depend on whenever you think your opponent's about to put up, like, a negation. And if you have a spot where you can drop it, you probably should. Preemptively, you also want to Crow the Smiger. You don't want this card to be in rotation to be able to get them to inclusion, because that card's also very problematic, and there's a lot of things that card can do, even if you try to, like, blow it up in the grave, it's still a reborn. So the best action is just getting rid of the Smiger. Lunalight's up next. This one is going to be very interesting, because we're starting to see this deck more and more. And Nibiru, again, is one of those things that's going to depend. You want to drop it before the first Liger comes out. So if your opponent has monsters on board and they activate Poly, usually I'm chaining Nibiru there and putting them on you don't have enough material to make a Liger Dancer. You can either DD Crow the target of Perfume, or you can just DD Crow Perfume. The third thing is, if your opponent uses Martin and Grave, DD Crow the Martin. I think that's really important to hit Martin, because your opponent can't just add Masquerade for free and they don't get the other body for free, and they can't just like bounce Tiger back either. So I think that either Perfume Target, or Martin are all very good answers, but I think hitting Martin is definitely like the best one for you. Bell on Wolf is the same thing as like Ogre on Wolf, right? It's another way for your opponent to banish and fuse, so definitely go ahead and make sure that you're using either of them on Wolf, or go ahead and hit Masquerade too, because Masquerade's also a problem. You can also Bell the Masquerade, so your opponent can't add back Poly and then use it to banish cards from grave. So you can go ahead and use Bell or Ogre on either of them. Ash on Hound is going to be your best spot, or Valor Imperium on Goldleo. I think that's like be-all, end-all. The best hit in the deck right now is to hit Goldleo. But the low-key underrated hit right now is to hit the Perfume with Ash Valor Imperium. Denying your opponent access to Perfume is really, really good. So denying the fusion to not get the spell is something that you should really keep in mind. Especially if you have like double Valor, hit Goldleo, they summon Perfume Dancer, and then hit the Perfume Dancer. And it's going to be a really rough time on your opponent. The next one I have for you today is Yummy. Now, this deck is very interesting, and there's so many different ways we can talk about hand trapping this deck, because it truly is versatile. There's a lot of ways that your opponent can open. and you can kind of gauge how good your opponent is based on how they play. Because realistically, if your opponent opens up only one cat, there's not a whole lot that they can do about playing around hand traps unless they normal summon a hand trap first and then go link one and then summon out a cat. So it really depends though, because if your opponent leaves like a Cupsy on board by itself, you're absolutely going to go ahead and Veiler or Imperium the Cupsy, right? You want to stop Cupsy Yummy, the main deck monster. A lot of times the extra deck monster doesn't really matter as much. If you can hit that, you should. But if you have Veiler Imperium still, just hit Cupsy. It's the #1 card you want to stop. You do not want to let Surprise get in rotation. But talking about Veiler Imperium, there's another spot that I think is really important, and that's if your opponent uses Obedient Schooled, and you're like, okay, my Veiler Imperium's dead, there's no way I can drop this. The combo in Obedient School summons Starham, and Starham has to summon back a monster from the grave that was used as synchro material and makes it a tuner. This is how your opponent's able to make Herald on your turn. So if you are able to go ahead and Veiler or Imperium the Starham, that's the choke point. Your opponent can't use that Starham anymore. Unless they like summon a Veiler, right? There's nothing that they can do about making that into a Herald anymore because it's not a tuner. So that's something that you should really keep in mind because it's pretty important. Now, this deck definitely has a spot where you want to drop Rock. So when your opponent uses the Lollipo Yummy Way, summon back 2 monsters and go for the Metal Marcher line, when Metal Marcher reborns a Synchro, at that moment, once the monster is summoned, Nibiru right away. This is a spot where you make the board a lot more minimal, and it's really hard for your opponent to try to go back through a Herald line. So they're going to put up kind of a mid-board, and it's not going to be the best thing for them. So this is definitely a spot where you want to drop Rock as soon as possible. DD Crow, again, is going to be very okay at best. You can DD Crow the minion target from Grave. Right now, before we get the Marshmallow, then you can go ahead and just DD Crow like minion from Grave. There's not a whole lot of perfect scenarios with DD Crow at the moment. If your opponent is going to tag out a Synchro and they have another Synchro in Grave, you can definitely talk about DD Crow on one of the Synchros in Grave, because that can be really important to try to get back, especially if your opponent doesn't have follow-up and they need like the Cupsy anyway that always ends up in the graveyard anyway. One of the ways that I really like to use Bell in this matchup is to kind of like force my opponent's hand to make an action to go ahead and return the Synchro to the extra deck to tag out, and then Belling the Synchro. It's one of the best things that you can do. And a lot of times you can put your opponent in some really awkward scenarios that they kind of have to tag out, and that's where Bell shines. Your goal, first and foremost, is always to stop Obedient Schooled. So if you have Ash, you're just stopping Schooled. But if your opponent leads like Cupsy, I'm just Ash and Cupsy. I think that card is the #1 card that you just want to stop. It's very strong, and Surprise is very good. You can always Ogre the minion, but if you can catch your opponent at a spot where they only have 1 Snatchy on the board, and then during your gameplay of like interacting of breaking their board, and then you can Ogre the Snatchy, I think that's just the best spot. There's a lot of times where players that play Yummy right now just don't understand that you need to keep 2 Snatchies up at all times if you can. And a lot of times where you catch people off guard is when they only have 1. They use it to try to Synchro, and you Ogre. It's brutal. So that's something that you really want to think about as well. If you haven't already checked out my Twitter, Twitch, Discord, Instagram, or subscribe to the YouTube channel, definitely go ahead and do so, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.